It's time to talk music, audio gear, and anything else that crosses our minds. I'm Mark.
And I'm Peter.
And welcome to the Hurton Audio Podcast. So Peter has just recently updated his pedal board with something very cool. Do you want to tell us about it, Peter?
Yeah, so my pedal board was, it was all right. It was working okay. I tried to run it in stereo, but really, I needed an actual amp sim because I had a cab sim and I used to send like a through thing into amps and stuff, but it just gets a bit messy and complicated. And then there's this full thing of I'm running like some Strymon pedals, like the Big Sky Timeline stuff in stereo. So I'm trying to capture the sound in stereo, and I've got, you know, like a tube amp and a sort of tube amp expander by Boss, which sort of helps out at recording it. But that's all mono, really, if we're talking about effect sends and that. As far as I've worked out, I could be wrong. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be easier if I just had a self-contained board, like a lot of people have, that you see like on Instagram and stuff? So I went for a UAD, or Universal Audio Dream 65 sort of Fender amp in a box, and it absolutely blew me away.
So for anybody who's unfamiliar, Peter, with what these like emulation sort of products are, instead of having a physical amplifier that you use, you just have a pedal that essentially mimics what an amplifier would do down to every detail and then recreates it. That is the general idea of these pedals.
Yeah, and the other thing is with these pedals is it's about the method of why do you want it. So if you want to feel an amp move air in a room, which is what a lot of people love that about these amplifiers, the actual real thing, that's fine. Get an amp. And especially if you're running mono, like I find, because I'm running stereo and because I want to record in a manner that is, you know, accurate and the same every time, this really suits me because I don't have to worry about microphones. And I don't have to worry about, you know, having an amp take up space or, you know, having to sort out any sort of loading, because a lot of people don't understand with these tube amps and vintage amps, you have to like crank it up to actually get the sound, and you've got to maintain these amps really well as well, you know.
And also you've got to think about, like, with you talking about a stereo rig, in order to do that with the authentic equipment, you just basically need to buy two full rigs and wire them together.
Essentially, yeah. And then there's that full thing of you've got to, if you want to turn the bass up, you've got to do it equally on both your amps and stuff like that. And, you know, I'm sure people who run physical amps in stereo rigs sort of know the ins and outs of this better than me. But it gets quite fiddly and very, very expensive. And number two, spacious. Like, you have to have a lot of space to have like a full parallel rig for left and right. And then, you know, there's a lot of complications that come with that. I know some people do some quite clever effects loops tricks with the guitar amps, but for me, I'd found that I just wasn't quite capturing the right sound, because, you know, I had stereo cab sim, but I think just the way that it was all wired up, it wasn't, that mono signal didn't seem to be hitting in the right place and then spreading to stereo. So I was finding, like, you know, I was getting, one side would have like a preamp and the other side wouldn't have the preamp, and it starts to sound weird. So this was just a solution to a problem. And also, a lot of people's talking about these Universal Audio pedals. They've just released the Lion, which is like a Marshall clone. So I think it was also on my mind for that. But I just thought, well, I'll try them out, because the other thing is with these is it's not you with an amp that, you know, you may not know the history of a vintage amp that you've bought. You may not know, you know, there's a tolerance with equipment. So you may have the exact same amp as somebody you really admire, but your amp may have a completely different sort of quirk, as it would be, that this guy that this person that you're emulating, their amp doesn't. So, you know, the thing with something like these UAD pedals or these Universal Audio pedals is that you've got somebody who is like their entire life essentially is getting these guitar amps to play unbelievably well and dialing in all the tones and miking them and stuff. So you just get that in a box. So it's like there becomes this thing where, say, if you're recording in a project studio, this takes like the guesswork and the figuring out of your hands. And there's, that's good because if you're, say, a novice at guitar tech and being like a technician with the way that you have to engineer an amp setup to get the right sound, you can have your amp coming at you in the room, but to actually capture that into your DAW, which I would like to think most people are, is a completely different beast.
Also, it takes the long-winded sort of trials of different microphones in different places that a lot of people would say, well, it doesn't sound like this record. And what these pedals are great for, from what I've seen as not a guitarist, is that it takes all of the guesswork out, and it just means that you can plug in and play, and you get the sound that you're after immediately. So I suppose for anybody who is always frustrated that whatever they record never sounds like the record that they're listening to, these are sort of like a pricey hack to say, well, now I can just get there with more consistency faster. And like you say, if you was in a band and you was going to different studios, it just makes your life a lot easier to have like a guaranteed turn that you're happy with.
Yeah, I think the word is consistency. Like what the Dream does is just be consistent, and it offers you options, but it will sound the same no matter where you play it. And that's the thing, I suppose, like if you're watching stuff like Mix with the Masters and they're talking about, going from hotel room to hotel room and trying to keep setups the same, that's where these shine more than anything. I mean, for some people who don't know, there's this really good story about how Dire Straits recorded Money for Nothing's iconic guitar sound. And they basically did it, and they went, well, we're not super happy with the performance or whatever the element was. They thought they could do it better but retain the vibe. And then they spent like either days or at least another full session in the studio just attempting to recreate the sound and feel of that guitar part with the exact same stuff in the same studio with Mark Knopfler playing the same guitar, and they just could not recreate it because, who knows? Maybe it was a different temperature. Maybe one of the connectors or something just had something that was an issue on the day that they liked that actually improved the sound, And that's why this sort of stuff can be really hard with recording, because it can all sound very simple. And I think definitely when you work in the box, it is simple because you pull up an Arturia like Juno synth and that's going to sound the same no matter what session you're on. But if you have an actual real life Juno, that's going to play up from time to time. There may be a day where it's got a quirk that actually inspires you and you want to record, and then you go to record with that same sound and you go, well, the chorus is back to normal and now I can't get that sound that I liked.
Yeah, and it's very difficult when you're trying to do things and you're trying to, be a problem solver. I suppose not everybody in like a studio environment, when they're encountering a problem, can say, actually, this is so interesting, let's make an idea out of this. Because a lot of the time, people have gear that is meant to do a set thing, like say with amps or keyboards, and they're looking for a set sound. And when it plays up or when there's something wrong, it's really tough. And like say with amps and guitar rigs and pedal boards, all you need is to like move the pedal board in the wrong place in the room and you'll get hum and buzz from like electrical sockets and stuff. And there's all kinds of stuff that makes recording really hard. And even like when it comes to just miking up a drum kit, like some of the mics just sound better on some days.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you could say, well, it's an angle thing, it's this, it's that, it's parallel, maybe the drums moved slightly so it gets a better tone, but it really is hard. It's like to say, no, 57 is exactly the same as another 57. They all have variations in microphones.
Yeah. So this is where we get to the idea of being the real thing, worse than the real thing, or even better than the real thing. I like to think of the U2 song. And the way that I would break this down is if you want authenticity, you can grab like the real thing and you may find that you get a good one. Maybe you buy a Dunlop, maybe you buy a Dallas Arbiter Fuzz Face, an original 1960s or 70s one, and you get one of the good ones that Eric Johnson hasn't apparently bought yet. You know,
oh yeah, because he's collecting all of them, isn't he?
Yeah, he's collecting all the good ones because apparently they have a massive tolerance for, you know, what actually people find desirable. So in that scenario, you say, well, the piece of equipment I want has a massive margin of error in the thing that I want from it. So maybe I go out and buy a recreation, something like the Dunlop Fuzz Face, the new silicone one. Maybe it's not as good as the thing you want, but it does the thing you want well enough and at a cheap enough price to warrant the purchase.
Yeah, and it's tough with recreations because there's one that comes to mind, like Dunlop also reissued the Rockman headphone amps, and there was a lot of debate online about if the Dunlop ones sound anything like the original X400, isn't it, or X100 Rockman headphone amps.
Yeah,
so,
I think X100.
So there's like there's an interesting thought, like you have things like Dream that is like very well thought out and it does exactly what you would want from the thing that it's meant to be doing, but it's also an original product.
Yeah.
But also you have like things that are like, well, a different company has bought the thing that you liked and they're manufacturing it in a different factory that's maybe slightly cheaper or doesn't have the same sort of parts, and so it's slightly different. And then this is like the nuance of going, well, what type of recreation is this, and is it faithful to the remaster, to the original, or is it like what the Dream is, where it's like a recreation that is hyper focused on a specific angle of that
but
thing.
You already tapped into this third part, which was even better than the real thing. So it's like you said, the Dream does maybe not what a Fender amp does, but exactly what you want and think in your mind a Fender amp does. And that's where I think you end up with the even better than the real thing argument, because this is where, and this is very, very applicable with plugins, because some plugins, you know, even like Chris Lord Alge's Waves range, his full point was that he has like a full mixing desk, like a 48 track, whatever mixing desk, or 128 track. I can't remember how big it is. And his full point is that some channels, like channel 1 might sound better than channel 4 on his mixing desk. So he wants to capture it where every channel sounds the best it can be. So he can just pick the best couple of channels and emulate them for accuracy, you know, over the board. And this is a very interesting thought, because here's where authenticity isn't necessarily the goal.
Yeah.
It's more idealism. And so there becomes a bizarre argument where, are these imitations or are these improvements? Or is it like, say, the Dream, where not only is it a really, really accurate recreation of what, you know, obviously of the actual amps and cabs, but also of what people want from them, what people want to do with them.
Yeah, because there's what the thing does, and then there's what the thing sounds like in most records after somebody's mixed it. So
yeah,
so there's a lot of like people who they get the guitar tone and they've got a load of the bass rolled up, and you know you can roll your bass up, somebody can record it and just high pass the bass straight out to mix. So it's like, even if you recorded it, it's not necessarily present when people hear the song.
Also, like tape saturation, like Neve saturation as it hits a Neve preamp.
Yeah, because
all these things affect the tone.
A lot of people talk about, like, you know, I'm sure if you've watched any music documentary, you've heard people say the Neve board or the Neve console, the Neve sound. And there's all this stuff happening with gear in studios, particularly if you're going... I mean, people still love Neves and stuff, but particularly if you're going back to, like, pre-90s recording, like, those vintage amps have been tuned and changed in the recording. You like, if you have examples like Def Leppard, the entire tape machine's been sped up, which changes the sort of the timbre of all of the instruments.
Yeah,
you
it
know.
slightly changes all the frequencies at play and all the actual dynamics.
So it's interesting to think about what people think of, because you can look at, say, Brian May playing on stage, and you can say, I want that Vox AC30 sound that Brian May has. And you can look at that as the amp. But if you're not thinking about the fact that he's playing a Red Special, it changes what the amp sounds like.
And a big part of the sound is the treble booster. It's such a simple device, but I think the treble booster in Brian May's setup is one of the most important things, because that's what gives it the bite. And I think, you know, whenever I play with any form of like treble boosting, it's funny how close that gets you to something like Brian May, even with different guitars and different amps, because, you know, that's just a process that a lot of people, I think, don't really try, you know, because a treble booster is such a simple thing. You think, well, I've got the treble knob on my amp.
Yeah.
You know, or I can just EQ it in the box, but it's all about the position, because the treble booster hits the front of the amp, it changes the way that the guitar responds and the way that the amp responds to the guitar. So it's like, there's so many different facets. And I noticed like on the UAD or Universal Audio, I'm sure it's both, but I'll try and say both. The Universal Audio Ruby, it's got like a treble booster built in, because that's what a lot of people did with it.
Yeah.
And that's what, I mean, I think all the pedals actually have boosts, because again, a lot of people like to put boosts in on these UAD ones, or on the original amps, should I say, because it, you know, at the time that was like quite an easy way of like changing and beefing up the sound.
I think the other thing that comes to mind, like I'm reading on the UAD site, you know, it says, you know, going direct into the front of house on stage and stuff. And what you can imagine, and I'm sure what thousands of sound guys or you know, sound people and stuff go through every day, is they have people rock up with these massive rigs of gear, and they say, well, this Marshall has to be at this volume to get the tone that I'm after. And the sound guy goes, well, I don't want it at that tone, it'll be too loud, it'll blow out all the mics and stuff. And you'll have this argument of the guitarist being like, well, if it's not at this sound, I can't perform properly, I can't get the tone that I'm after, that the band has the sound for. And this is like partly why a lot of these sort of emulators and stuff come around, because it's very hard to get amps to behave in the manner you want, like in a controlled environment.
Yeah.
Because you can't just turn some of the amps down, because it doesn't have the same effect that, you know, people are looking for. I suppose it's a similar thing to like having a drummer who just hits really, really hard.
Yeah,
and then they're in like a small
comes in.
bar, and they're like, can you not just you know, like rein it back a bit? And the drummer's like, that's the sound that I'm trying to play.
Or like somebody comes in to fill in, say the drummer's off for some reason, and somebody else comes in, and the band's like, yeah, this isn't right. It's like, well, the drummer's just playing slightly softer, because that's like maybe more normal for them. But it can change the entire feeling of a performance. And I suppose what we are getting into today is the nuance of things. But it's an important thing to think about, especially if you're starting out, because a lot of these sort of discussion points aren't really a thing, even if you go do a degree, I feel like.
Yeah.
You know, this gets so nitpicky that you have to go to places like JHS Pedals or Vertex Effects. I mean, Vertex Effects, he's always talking about buffers, buffer this, buffer that, and how most 99% of buffers are apparently rubbish. I mean, I've got a Fender buffer, but he was saying apparently if your buffer has an EQ in it, it's not a good buffer. And I'm like, well, what buffer doesn't? Like, I know his doesn't have an EQ, but it gets to that point where, you know, it's that nitpicky. And I suppose it's how deep do you want to dive, or do you even want to do that dive? Do you want to say, well, I'm going to get Native Instruments guitar rig or amplitude, and I'm going to get something that works for me and something that's easy, and I don't have to worry about where things are plugged in because it's a plug-in. And this is why I'm saying as well, like the even better than a real thing argument, you know, it's a bit like the packs we make. We make these packs full of vintage Rompler sounds and stuff. And a lot of people be like, whoa, I really, really like the drum sound on like Korg M rack or whatever. Sorry, and Sonic and R rack or a Korg M3R. and they'll be like, I'm not piping MIDI into one of them though. It'd take me forever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and we've had this same problem with using some of these vintage sort of synthesizers, these rack synths. It's actually more convenient to sample the drums and play it in on like a Kong or whatever your DAW sampler is than to actually run one MIDI track out, because a lot of them are stereo out, so you'd have to run the kick drum out, sit through the full 3 minutes or do it in like sections, then do the snare, then do tom 1, or if you want to do the 3 toms, you can do the 3 toms. Then do you do the hi-hat and cymbals individually? Do you do them all together? And it makes it very long-winded.
You know, you have decision fatigue before you've even laid down your drum, and that's providing your sequencing. God forbid you're playing these things like a finger drummer or anything like that, or with drum triggers.
And then you have to think like, well, if I just want that full kit together, then I don't have the isolated instruments to mix. So you lose flexibility there. If you track them all one by one, you may have full minutes of recordings where nothing's happening because you're recording a tom.
And there's only 2 tom hits in the song.
Only 2 tom hits in like a 3-minute song. So yeah, it is easy. So it's like you say, what we're trying to do with like some of the packs, particularly with the Romplers, is give people on Reason like a condensed, idealistic version of the sounds. You don't get every sound, but you get some of the best sounds, and that the best is subjective. But if you want the full thing, go buy the rack. That's the thing. It's a bit like
I would say
amps.
Most people, and this comes back to the amps, don't want the full thing. They don't want the real thing because they're like, well, I don't know. I'm never gonna be able to turn that Marshall on, you know, I might live in a flat or something. And that's the problem where you're at. And I think this is why the audio like tech industry and the home production industry is having such a boom, like a continuous boom, is because there's all these things that you can size down. I mean, I've just seen that Boss have released like the Katana plug-in air, whatever it is, which is it plugs into your guitar and sends it wirelessly into headphones. So you don't have an amp, but you feel like you have an amp because it's a headphone amp thing. And, you know, these are all markets. And I know the headphone amp thing isn't new. It's been like, it's one of the oldest inventions, I think, in guitar
If you're thinking
tech.
about like the orange squeezer stuff.
Yeah, the original, can't remember what the brand is, orange squeezer and stuff that you plug straight into your guitar. And they're not maybe the same as headphone amps, but they're sort of, at the time, they were the equivalent of, because Vox have done them for a long time too. But these are all solving problems of, well, I like this sound and I like to play the guitar with this sound, but I don't have the luxury of cranking a PA or an amp in my room, you know. Maybe you have a nice amp, but you can't afford the tube expander and an interface and all this stuff to run it silently, you know, because that's the great thing with the tube expanders being like the Universal Audio Auxbox or the Boss was a tube expander. There's a ton of them out there, Palmer, Rockman, everybody's got one from various eras. But they are so clever because you can take any amp you already own and essentially digitize it in a weird way, because once you use a tube expander, it ceases to operate like a regular amplifier, you know, because it can be run silently at full volume. It can be run, you know, through it just comes straight out an XLR into your interface and stuff like that. And that's what's really fantastic with them.
It's a bit like the Kemper, where people will profile, essentially sample a guitar amp at all different settings and then create those profiles to use a Kemper. And the thing is, right, think of a gigging band here. This is where a lot of these products come into play, right? If you're a gigging band and the guy at the airport, I'll try not to say guy for everybody, but the guy at the airport throws your suitcase and misses the runner, and it smashes into the concrete floor, and your nice valve amp's toasted.
Yeah.
You know, if they do that with your Kemper, well, you can just buy a new one. Yeah, gutted, it's a Kemper, but you know, you can just buy a new one.
Some of these valve amps are priceless.
And
that's what it comes down to.
You know, it's like the Hit It For Late. They learned that priceless Martin guitar that Kurt Russell has recently said was only worth 15 grand when he smashed it, but after he smashed it, it was suddenly worth 100 grand or 200 grand, because obviously they could say, well, what's the damages? But, you know, the point is you can't just buy another one, and like with some of the like Junos and stuff, you can just go buy another one, but it has to be somebody else's. You can't just go buy one from the shop. And
if so many break here and there, you either got to have people bring them back up to scratch, or if they get sliced in half like a Martin guitar or something, or smashed to smithereens, there's only so much you can fix. So I think the problem with the idea of vintage equipment is they get rarer and more scarce, but also they do take damage. So if you pick up like a real cheap amp, you might find it's cheap for a reason. The valves might be old or just completely knackered or inoperable. You might find that there's issues with the preamp and with the EQ and stuff. I mean, really small issues with some of the equipment, like just having to walk all of the controls just endlessly, like because you've got noise in your circuit, so having to open it up and contact clean stuff, that can be a simple fix. But if it's a deeper issue, then you've got to go to a specialist, or you've got to become a specialist, because anybody really can become a specialist. If you go to channels like Wampler and stuff, he's like, we're going to build a tube amp.
Yeah.
And you can learn how to do it. It's just hard work.
But like the ideal thing with the Dream and the Lion and the Ruby from UAD is if you think about how many people can get the sound without having to, we've trashed the brand new Marshall stack that we've just got delivered because, X, Y, or Z, particularly with touring bands, this is a real issue because people do have things get damaged. And the other thing, like you say, Peter, is you get that variation with some of these even better than real things. And not everybody can be Joe Bonamassa sat in a room full of the same Fender amplifier. He just hoards the vintage ones, like the deluxe ones.
And the cabs. Like he actually donated a cab for one of them. I think it's the Marshall one. He donated a cab, or he lent them a cab at Universal Audio to actually sample for or to digitize, however we say it. I'm not sure exactly what to do.
But the only thing is, it depends what you're looking for. Now, if you go to a studio, a recording studio, and they just have a few emulators or say, right, here's a Line 6 pod, there you go.
It's not very exciting.
It's not very exciting if you're paying to go to a studio. Same as if you go to a studio and they slam you on an electric drum kit and say it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. We can get the drum take. You don't need a drum kit. People have their sort of like their ideal things that they want to use, and it's about finding the tool set. Like you say, you've got the Dream, Peter, for when you want to use your pedals predominantly and get a good ready, sort of studio ready tone after your pedal board, which you couldn't really do with your Orange amp. But if you want your Orange amp, you can just use your Orange amp with a single pedal.
And I could even do the thing where I attempt to run the Dream into the Orange amp, or I can just bypass the Dream and use my pedal board the same way I used it before. These are all options that I can do, but it's all about convenience. Also, though, now I know, since I like the sound of the Dream so much, if I ever wanted to take that next step and absolutely spend a ton of money, I could look for an original Fender Deluxe or just look for a Fender head, knowing how much I like that. And that's a sort of another thing. You could get the Arturia V collection and say, everybody talks about the Juno, but it's, maybe it's I'm trying to think of one of the obscure synths, but I can't, so I'll say maybe it's the Yamaha DX7 you prefer over the Juno, and maybe you was contemplating buying a real keyboard for your studio, like a hardware one, and you think, well, I was going to buy the Juno because everybody was talking about it, but instead, I'm going to buy the DX7 because I tried them in the Arturia V collection, and I figured out which one I wanted. That's what the products like these Universal Audio pedals are great for. You might be like, I want a really, really good, say you're a recording studio, you're like, I want one really, really good vintage of the era amp, but I don't know which one that is. So I'm going to buy a couple of these Universal Audio pedals, even if it's like one a month or whatever, if you're like a project studio or something, if you can afford that. And you can figure out which amp you actually want to buy of the vintage range.
Which amp the customers always ask for.
Yeah.
Do you have this sound?
Yeah.
Do you have that sound? And then you can go, well, you see, if you've got Marshalls in your studio, but you have, say, the Dream and the Ruby, if somebody says, I want that Vox sound, you can say, well, I've got the thing for you, without having to stock a load of different cabs and amps and stuff as well. So
yeah. So I think that's the thing, do you think these things are imitations, or do you think that these things are better than the real thing?
Imitation or innovation?
Yeah.
How about that? Something snappy.
Or the main thing, is there room for both? I mean, I would say there is, but somebody else, maybe they might say, well, look, if you got the Dream, why would you ever go back to your original? Somebody might be like, well, why would you ever use the Dream when the original's got the vibe? So these things to think about when you're looking at equipment and using equipment in your studios.
Yeah, and let us know what you're using in the Q&As and stuff. And thanks for listening, everybody.